I call to order the Board of Education special meeting of September 22nd, 2020 at 5:02 p.m. I'll just do a roll call of Board of Education members. Karina Drake is not able to be here tonight. Liz Global will join us for the second part of the meeting. Nora Gatos. Here. Kathleen Hulse. Here. Rachel Ruggieri. Here. Sean McAvoy.
Here.
Ken Schoberg should be joining us shortly, I hope. Jonathan Steckler.
Here.
Margaret Stamatis. Members of the public have the ability to watch this meeting through a live stream on our Board of Education website and YouTube channel, as with any Board of Education meeting. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. De Silva.
All right, so hello everyone and welcome back after another board meeting last night. So tonight's focus is a little bit different. We have a retreat. We will have a couple of special guests here tonight that will facilitate and guide our conversation and hopefully give us the foundation for the school year, which we'll talk about in another minute. We actually were going to start off with a quick prompt just to set the stage for our evening together and the work that we're a part of or planning to be a part of starting tonight and hopefully productively for the year. In a minute we'll talk about the purpose of our evening together and set the stage for the remainder of the night. So I'm actually going to ask everyone to think about the prompt that's up on the board. This work matters to me because, and I'm going to try to elevate my voice since I don't have a mic, and I'm going to randomly pick somebody to start, and then we'll go right from there. And I think Dr. Hanaway knew I was going to call her. She saw it coming. I mean, because she put her head down, I absolutely no choice. Like the good teacher that I am. So Dr. Hanaway.
I'm going to let you pretend I'm smiling at you right now.
That's right. And just to be clear, I actually changed the prompt about 30 seconds before I walked in here, Dr. Hanaway, so you may want to look at the one that's up on the board.
Yeah, okay.
This work matters to me because?
Because I believe in public school education, and I believe that everyone should have the right to quality education as part of their citizenship and tax dollars, and that's why it's really important to me.
Okay. Rachel?
I love children, and education is a passion of mine, so I'm very happy to be here.
This work matters to me because giving back to my community is a large part of my values, and I have always done that through work that serves the youth in the community that I live. Education has been one of the ways I've done that, and I do believe in a good public education for everyone, so it tied everything together.
This work matters to me because I do care deeply about children. I do care deeply about teachers. I see myself as a teacher, albeit in this role. I think and come to each and every day as a teacher, and I know that together, collectively, when we work with one another, we can provide the best experience for children in public education.
This work matters to me because every kid in town deserves to get a great education, to be able to learn and grow, and it's on the community to make sure that happens.
This work matters to me because I want to make a difference in the lives of children, teachers, and in the community that I've grown to love.
John?
This work matters to me because I have the ability, knowledge, and experience in order to help all those who do help the children with their education, and the parents and the taxpayers of the town.
Sean?
This work matters to me because both of my kids have enjoyed a great education here in town, and I wanted to find a way to learn more about that and amplify it as I get back to the town.
This work matters to me because I've spent all of my adult life in the field of education, and I truly believe that public education is a great equalizer and the most important thing for the future of our country and for all children to be able to take place and participate in a democratic society.
Karen?
This work matters to me because I too believe in the institution of public education and that all children deserve the best opportunities possible. And I working cohesively with everybody to do the best for the students here in Ridgefield.
Welcome, Ken. So we have a prompt that's asking each of us to talk a little bit about this work matters to me because, and you can fill in the blank. And we're exceptional at wait time here.
I know, it's good, it's good. But this work matters to me because, you know, if we don't, you know, to be an advocate for children, if we don't speak on their behalf, you know, who will? And I think we do have a responsibility to the next generation to make sure that that they're provided the opportunities they need to grow into effective adults.
So I probably should have mentioned that behind, oh, well, perfect. There's nothing like a teacher putting somebody on the spot.
I was paying bills.
Thank you. Welcome, Joe. So Joe, we just went around the room and we asked each of us to describe why this work matters.
Right.
So this work matters because, and we heard a lot of inspirational messages up until now, and so continue to inspire us, Joe.
Oh, boy.
This work matters to me because,
Well, basically, my position and the interaction I have with the board on all different levels. So it's important for me to see how the board operates and what I can do to help the board and vice versa.
thanks, Joe, welcome. So just behind Ken and Rachel, there's some cookies, some candy. Everyone knows that there's a restroom behind. There's cold waters in the fridge, and there's some, I think, warm waters on the counter, just in case you didn't notice that on your way in.
Thank you.
All right, so Margaret, would you like to walk us through the purpose of tonight?
I will. So tonight, well, first of all the board members at least have had your board training, either through a workshop with the superintendent and board council, and many of us have also done that through CAVE. We've also been together as a board for about 10 months now, through the hiring of a superintendent, through a tough budget cycle, and now ultimately through an unprecedented pandemic. So today is not meant to be board training 1.0. It's assuming we've already got a foundation. So we're going to be building on that foundation tonight together. Ideally, the retreat would have been over the summer. I think we had initially targeted July, as you all know. But obviously, reopening plans had to take a priority. The idea here tonight is to look back, but mostly to look forward and set the path for the upcoming year and years, to be honest. We also have a strong leader now to help us. We have not had that consistent leadership for a few years, and that has affected the board's ability for forward thinking. And I know our administration understands the implications of that, as does the board. Our board's main governance responsibility is policy and budget, and where we collaborate on our work is in our board meetings. The policy and budget decisions we make set the framework, and they should support the priorities identified this evening. The agenda for our meetings allows us the opportunity to discuss those items in meetings where the work of the board is done in public. So we'll contemplate tonight how those discussions could happen at the committee level and at the full Board of Education level. The other thing we'll do tonight is to tie back to our vision of the graduate and the board's role with that. Sometimes it's really hard to draw the line between the decisions we make at the table and how those ultimately impact our graduates. There's also an element of delayed gratification. Decisions we make today, we may not see until much later, probably when we're off the board. Ken alluded to some of that. But what we do matters at central office and in our classrooms and in the community. And we achieve that in partnership with our central office staff and superintendent, which is why we're here collaboratively tonight. One last thought as we go through tonight's exercises, we need to think about a non-COVID world tonight as we look forward. Although obviously COVID is top of mind for all of us, what we're going to be discussing tonight is what our world will also look like post-COVID. I think that some of us have realized that some of the changes and innovation that has happened recently because of COVID helped move a district that many describe school districts as a Titanic. Trying to shift and make change can be very, very, very slow. But we kind of had to do that overnight in a couple of weeks in March, right? And we've been able to fine tune that and make that better since then. And I think there are some opportunities and innovation that have presented themselves. So think about that as we think tonight and as we talk about what a world post-COVID can look like for our students and our staff and our district. And I would also anticipate, although we won't be talking about budget tonight, but I anticipate that some of the budget discussions that we'll have in January and February will contemplate the non-COVID world. And again, that budget will be set by some of the priorities that we discussed tonight. So I think I didn't go through the bullet points there, but I think I touched on all of them. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Dr. DeSilva.
What's interesting is that we're being recorded. It's a live meeting for families at home to tune in, and we're glad that they have the opportunity to do so. What I think is really important for us to consider is to be as comfortable as possible. Because while it is a formal meeting, we really want to engage with one another in ways that we might not normally engage. And that's the difference between a retreat, I think, and a Board of Education meeting or a workshop. We're going to be moving around the room. It's going to be far more interactive than a normal Board of Education meeting or a typical Board of Education meeting. So hopefully you'll feel comfortable doing that, despite the fact that obviously that there is an element of trying to be loud enough so people can hear you while you're being recorded and all of those natural things. But what really matters tonight is that we're comfortable engaging with one another so that we do build that foundation for the work in the COVID world and far longer, or the long haul. So here, I've shared this agenda with the Board of Education. I don't need to read it to you, but we are going to start our work tonight with Rebecca Santiago, who is our attorney from Shipman and Goodwin and collaborates with us on many, many different areas of our work. Later, you'll hear from Isabel Stevenson, who is here from the Center of School Change, sitting in the back of the room. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit later. So Isabel is a good eyes and ears to the night as we begin. You'll hear from me around our my entry plan and what I've learned from that work and some of the priorities that I would suggest that we move forward to, or at least the cabinet members look forward to working on this year, or thinking about at minimum. We'll talk about the vision of the graduate. I think all of us, with the exception of perhaps Karen Dewing, maybe Kathleen, were not here during the vision of the graduate, and so I know for me, entering in to Ridgefield, it's new. I know for Dr. Hanaway, she wasn't here, and I think for many of our board members. So understanding why we have a vision and what our role is with the vision of the graduate is important in terms of the foundation. Later, we'll talk about how all of this fits into the master agenda and giving board members an opportunity to weigh in on what that agenda should look like or can look like. Using the auspices of Ruler, which you heard from this past spring, you heard from our school-based administrators as they talked about the priorities in their school and how it fit into Ruler and how we perhaps can use a charter similar for our Board of Education so that we can engage in the work productively. And then I think at the end of the night, we will have the luxury to go home and you will stay for your board evaluation. Make sense? Okay. So at any point, you can get up and get a cookie and no one will shame you for it, and we'll feel pretty good. So Rebecca, I'm gonna give you the clicker. Liz is gonna click on your presentation, and you can begin by helping us understand some problem. Yep, here it goes, problem solving
I was
scenarios.
gonna say, probably should not trust me with the clicker.
You might need to use it to click in the clicker, click forward and back, but you want me to click? Is that easier?
Well, I could probably.
Would you rather the keyboard?
Let's see. Why not? All right.
Left,
Rock and
right.
roll. Okay. So I noticed on the agenda, I have only about like a half an hour, right? Or 40
Ish. We work in ish.
Ish. Okay.
Except when it comes to social distancing, but other than that.
Okay. All right, well, because lawyers like to talk, and so I need to know my rules and my parameters. But what I'm gonna do is I agree that I don't think you need board responsibilities 101, but maybe this is like 102. So we're gonna do like a little bit of refresher about some of the important laws and requirements that the roles that you play in your as a board member, I've got some hypotheticals and some things to try to work through and to try to talk through. I'm not sure how much we'll be able to do in a time frame like that, so we'll see, and we'll just take it as we go. But I'm so excited to be here, and I hope this is helpful, and I do hope that people will be unafraid to partake in some conversation about some of these topics, because I think it's really important, and I'm hopeful that it'll be beneficial. It's good to see you all, and here we go. All right, so a quick refresher on, am I standing in the way of it? Probably. A quick refresher on roles and responsibilities always has to start with meetings, right? Because boards of education function through a meeting. Outside of a meeting, the Board of Ed doesn't have any actions, any authority. I think this is really important. I always give this speech when I talk to boards of education because the person in the supermarket doesn't always understand that, right? They think, well, I can tell you what my big issue is and then you can magically fix it. But the answer to that is no, you can't magically fix that. You can only magically fix it if the other members of the board vote to take action. Absent that, you don't have individual authority. So that is something that's constraining, but I think also makes you function as a unit, and is important in understanding. It's also important to understand that just because you function at a board meeting doesn't mean that you can't live your life and participate in the community. I've heard all kinds of wonderful things about why you want to be board members and why this work is so important to you. Just because you're a board member doesn't mean that you lose the ability to be a part of your community, but, there's a but, you do have to be cautious. You have to be cautious about what you say. You absolutely have free speech rights. You don't lose your free speech rights when you become a board member. However, you want to be clear that there's a distinction between speaking as an individual who has free speech rights and speaking on behalf of the board. And I think it actually goes even further than that. I put on my bullet points that you have the cloak of office, because there's also a perception piece. Even if you go on a website and you say, I am speaking as Rebecca Santiago, not as the counsel for the Ridgefield Board of Education. If people know I'm counsel for the Ridgefield Board of Education, it colors how they're hearing what I'm saying, right? So I do think that you have to be extra cautious about how you say things and what you say things, and it goes even beyond being clear. I think it's important to be clear regardless, but I think you need to be cautious. And I know we've had some issues come up with this in the past and some questions about what is appropriate to say on social media and things like that. And it's a tough thing for every Board of Education to deal with, making sure that that line is maintained, because I want you to be active members of your community, but I do also want you to be cautious. Here's another reason I want you to be cautious. There is an indemnification statute in Connecticut that protects Board of Education members, because we appreciate volunteers who are willing to give this amount of time and energy and effort towards something so challenging but so important. And what that indemnification statute says, and I want you to particularly look at the part that I've put in italics, and I'll try not to stand in the way of it, but what it says is that you are protected by this indemnification statute. And if someone were to sue a member of the Board of Education for any claim or demand by reason of negligence or other act involving accidental bodily injury, but it goes on to say, including but not limited to infringement on any person's civil rights resulting in any injury, which acts are not wanton, reckless, or malicious. And it says that the acts have to be within the scope of their employment or on the direction of the Board of Ed. So, if you're acting as an individual and you go on a website and you make a comment that's in your individual capacity, are you covered by this statute? No, right? Because you're not acting at the direction of the Board of Education. And it's not within the scope of your role. So I do caution people that you're wearing that cloak of office, you're making a statement and you want to be cautious about what you say, because the indemnification only covers you within that role. So what do you think it means in the statute to be acting under the direction of the Board of Education? Is anyone brave enough to join me in these? I'm gonna force Margaret to.
I would say that we're only acting under the direction of the Board of Education when we're at a Board of Education meeting, or if at a Board of Education meeting, the board directs one of us to do something outside of that meeting, but otherwise
Right.
I would say it would be at a meeting.
So as we said a moment ago, right, you have authority only as a unit. So unless somebody is authorized, the board can vote to authorize a member of the board to act in a certain capacity or to speak on a particular topic, and then you would be acting on behalf of the Board of Education. But if you're not doing that, then you're acting in your individual capacity. I think when we're talking about indemnification, another important thing to talk about is what does it mean, what does wanton, reckless, or malicious mean? I know questions I get a lot from lots of districts is, am I covered by the indemnification clause if people have disagreements with my COVID-19 reopening plan? What do you guys think?
Yes.
I think you are, as long as it's not wanton, reckless, malicious. So what does that mean? Wanton, reckless, that generally means that you're acting in disregard of, you're acting in a way that's in disregard of possible injury or bad results. Malicious, again, means like you're intentionally not recognizing known risks. But if you're acting in accordance with what your public health department is recommending, what your administrators who are educational experts are recommending, I would say that you're not wanton, reckless, or malicious, right? Where we have concerns about that is if we're not following what the Department of Public Health might be recommending, or what the data suggests, then you might have concerns. But I think as long as you are being conscious to abide by what good data, I'm sure you're aware, right? You're never going to be able to have something that everybody agrees upon. But if you come up with an agreement, if the board votes on something that's supported by data, that's been carefully planned and thought through, it's not going to be wanton, malicious, or reckless, right? Any other questions about that? Because I know that one is a question that I get a lot.
I have a question.
Sure.
So acting on the advice of the health department, we couldn't be seen as reckless. If we're acting on the advice.
I think it certainly supports the position, right? So reckless means that you're disregarding data and evidence. And so, right, so I think the more you have concrete information on which to rely, the less likely that someone could tell you it's reckless.
So the next piece of that is on the bottom zinger line there with the school start times.
Right.
Could somebody argue that a board member has been, or a board has been reckless if they disregarded data that said that the school start time was unhealthy for the students?
Well, that was a hotly debated issue, and there was, as I'm sure you're aware, there were people on both sides of that issue, and there were scientists, and there was evidence on both sides of that issue. So I think
But not reckless, either way.
right, because I think if all of the data supported that it was dangerous, and there wasn't any data that supported the other piece of this, or any logical reason for choosing another path, then it's a question that for discussion. But if you look up what reckless and malicious means, it's acting in a way that is substantially certain to cause injury without cause or excuse. That's the legal definition of malicious. So in the school start time realm, you aren't acting, even if there is data to support a contrary argument, anytime. What does it matter what topic it is? Whatever contentious topic or challenging topic. There may always be an argument to the contrary viewpoint, but as long as the decision that the board is making isn't certain to cause injury without cause or exercise or excuse, then you shouldn't be in this standard. That doesn't mean people won't disagree with you. It just means I don't think it's wanton, reckless or malicious because you had good cause. You had valid reasons. You weren't certain it was going to have, you weren't certain to result in injury without a reason to make the decision that you made. All right? Moving on. Okay, so who can call a meeting? I have, the next couple slides are just about calling meetings and about agendas. I'm gonna try to go through them quickly. Who can call a meeting? Which statement is incorrect? Any board member can call a meeting. The board chair has total control of the agenda, and 3 board members can require that a meeting be held. Does anyone think any of these are, which do we think are right? Does the board member, can any board member call a meeting?
I think no.
No, I think you're right. You need more than 1, you need 3. The board chair has total control of the agenda. Who writes the agenda in a board meeting?
The board chair together with the superintendent.
Right, so not total control, but she does manage the agenda. 3 board members can require that a meeting be held. That one actually is accurate. This is kind of like a trick question because it's like the bar exam. It's A but not B, but B but not C, and right, yeah. Just keeping you on your toes. So here's the statute that says that 3 board members can ask for a meeting. But what this statute really pertains to is it's making sure that you don't have boards of ed or agencies that just never meet. It's not really about what's on the agenda. We're going to talk about what's on the agenda in a minute. It's really about making sure that you can have a meeting. So if 3 board members want to have a meeting, they want to make sure that there is a meeting, 3 board members can request a meeting. And if no meeting is called within 14 days, then they just give notice and the meeting is convened. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they dictate what's on the agenda. So let's talk about how we decide what's on the agenda. You have a board bylaw. What dictates what's on your agenda is board bylaws. So it's a little bit different in different communities. But in your bylaw, it says, which is relatively standard, your bylaw says the chairperson of the board, in consultation with the superintendent, which is very common, shall formulate the written agenda for regular and special meetings. Members of the board who wish for items to be included on the board agenda refer them in writing to the chairperson of the superintendent. So it does dictate that the chair, in consultation with the superintendent, control the agenda. The Freedom of Information Act does have certain requirements for the agenda. It has to set, the purpose of a board meeting, you need to let people know what you're going to talk about, so you have to be relatively clear about what's on the agenda so people know whether they want to attend that meeting. It's got to be specific enough. It can't just be broad. You can't just say personnel matter or other business or something very broad. You have to reasonably describe what you're talking about, because the idea is that these are open meetings and that people should be able to know what the topic is so that if they want to attend, they can. The responsibility for developing the agenda is usually specified in the board bylaws, as we just discussed. There's also a way, after the agenda is written, it is possible to change the agenda in a meeting, but it depends on the kind of meeting. So I'm going to quickly remind you of the types of meetings. First of all, I'm going to remind you of what a meeting is. A meeting under Freedom of Information Act is incredibly broad, as we've discussed when we've spoken in the past. It's a hearing or any other proceeding of a public agency, convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Pretty hard to be broader than that, right? So very, very broad. Just a convening, talking about something over which you have jurisdiction and which a quorum is present. There are some exceptions to this. It does not include a personnel search committee. So when you're hiring certain, perhaps when you did this when you hired your new superintendent, you can have a meeting that's not covered by the rules for agendas and minutes and public access. If it's a personnel search committee for an executive level candidate, a chance or social meeting. So if you accidentally, you all live in the same town, so that's entirely possible that you could all end up at the same open house. Or you could all end up at various social events. That doesn't make it a meeting. Although I will be careful to say that if you're all at that open house and you decide to have a little meeting in the parking lot to discuss a matter over which is on the agenda for the next night, that might be a little dangerous. But assuming you just say hello, greet each other as a social gathering, that is not a meeting, even if a quorum of you are present. Strategy or negotiations with respect to collective bargaining. So this is recognizing that, of course, in order to be able to bargain effectively, we have to be able to do that in a confidential setting, because if you were to do all of your negotiations in public, the union would get to hear us tell them exactly what we're willing to do, and there wouldn't be much bargaining, right? I would probably make it a little bit more challenging for us to negotiate a deal if we had to announce in public what we were willing to agree upon. So in recognition of that, you are able to have negotiations with respect to collective bargaining in a confidential setting. And also a caucus of a member of a single political party. But it really does have to be a single political party. It can't be like a single political party and the one guy we like from the other party. It has to truly be a single political party. Okay, so now I'm going to get to my meetings really, really quickly, because I've got to get through this.
Get to some scenarios.
Get to some scenarios. So there's 3 categories of meetings: regular, special, emergency. The main distinction, well, all meetings have to be noticed in advance, but the main distinction between the type of meetings is that a regular meeting is noticed in January, that your agendas have to be posted, they all have to be posted 24 hours in advance, but new items can be added to the agenda by 2/3 vote. You cannot add new meetings to the agenda of a special meeting. So if you decide to call a special meeting, that's fine, but whatever the agenda is the agenda is. You can't adjust it after that. So to return to my question about adding things to the agenda, board chair and superintendent develop the agenda. Other members of the board may add things with 2/3 vote, but only if it's a regular meeting. Okay? And the minutes for all meetings have to be posted within 7 days, both available for public inspection and then also on the website. An emergency meeting is the last kind of meeting, but this is one that probably will never arise because the Freedom of Information Commission has made very clear that they mean emergency when they say emergency, not just, oh darn, I forgot to notice that meeting. So it really has to be something that is of an emergency nature. And so what an emergency meeting, you can call a meeting without having any notice. You don't have to have the 24 hours notice, and you don't have to have the agenda posted 24 hours in advance. But it really has to be an emergency, and you have to, within 72 hours of holding the meeting, you have to explain the nature of the emergency and why there was no way in which you could satisfy those conditions that are required under the statute.
Rebecca, could you give us an example? So this year, for example, this summer, there were lots of things happening with the reopening of school, and there was a time that I thought I needed an emergency meeting. Can you give me and it wasn't, but based on, I think, what you described.
Well, we decided it probably wasn't worth the risk, because the Freedom of Information Commission pushes back really hard. There's been several Freedom of Information cases where the Freedom of Information Commission has pushed back on districts, because as you might, the whole point of the Freedom of Information Act is to make as many meetings be public and to make sure that districts and other public agencies are transparent. So whenever we take away that transparency and we don't post an agenda and we don't follow those criteria, we really need to have some absolute emergency to do so. It's hard for me to come up with an example, but I mean, I think the examples have been things like there's, I don't know, maybe something wrong with the building and you need to authorize, you need to make a decision to address some sort of emergent issue and the board needs to vote to approve it, and if you wait, then it will be a safety emergency. Something like that would clearly fit the criteria. When we talked about it, it was about the calendar, I believe.
Yeah, it was a shift in the calendar.
There was a
and
shift
having
in the
to close
calendar, which was a
school.
tough call because it was something that we wanted to get noticed to parents, but you have the authority as the CEO of the district to make a decision about the closure of school, and then we decided that it is possible to decide to change the school calendar after the fact. But it's always a tug and pull. We're trying to figure out, is it worth risking not having that transparency? Because that transparency is required by the law, but it's also something that allows the public to trust in us. And so we certainly don't want to overuse it. I don't think you're in a situation where you do overuse it, but this is intended to be used extremely sparingly.
So in that example, if we had called an emergency meeting to handle this, and the FOIC determined that it wasn't a valid reason for an emergency meeting, what would the ramifications have been?
I mean, it depends. It could be anything from a letter that says, don't do it again, to saying the action that you took at that meeting was invalid. But mostly, we just don't want to do this because we don't want to incur the expense of having to go to the Freedom of Information Commission. And more importantly, we don't want to lose the trust of our community that we are acting in a way that wouldn't be as transparent as we could possibly be. But the Freedom of Information Commission mostly, they make a decision and they have the right to fine you. They have the right to invalidate your decisions, and they have the right to just issue an order saying that you violated the act. And they can do any of those things in varying degrees. Another thing that, since we're talking about meetings, and obviously we're dealing with a unique year, I did want to spend a few minutes talking about virtual meetings due to COVID. So there's an executive order that remains in effect right now that says that open meeting requirements are suspended to the extent necessary to permit any public agency to meet and take such actions authorized by the law without permitting or requiring in-person public access to such meetings, and to hold such meetings or proceedings remotely by conference call, video conference, or other technology provided. That, and then there's specific requirements, which I'm sure you guys have been engaging in because you've been having virtual meetings. But the key is that absent this is clear that the way that the Freedom of Information Commission and the state views the current state of the law is that open meetings require there to be a place. And until this year, that's the case. I mean, whenever we had a meeting, it had to have a location where the public could go to be able to see what was happening. And what they did was say that that was suspended because of those safety concerns. And then in order to make sure, though, that people had access, they required certain things, like the public has to be able to view or listen to each meeting in real time by telephone, video, or other technology. The meeting has to be recorded and transcribed and available so that people, again, can have opportunity to see what's happening at the meeting, even though they can't be physically present in the building. It has to be posted on the agency's website, and information about how the meeting would be conducted so that people could access the online materials. And then also, in light of this, the executive order requires that the materials that you review at the meeting be posted on the website in advance so that people can access those in advance, since they won't be here in our building in order to attend the meeting. And then finally, it requires that speakers taking part in the meeting clearly state their name and title before speaking. So, some queries for us to chat about, right? Should the board continue holding virtual meetings now that school is in person? What do we think?
Yes.
Yes, both of you can weigh in one at a time, I guess.
I'd say no,
You say no and you say yes?
Yes.
Why do you think no?
because we're saying they should all be there
Yeah, we should
and
too.
putting themselves at risk or out there and every single day surrounded by people, and yet we're staying under the guise of like virtual. It doesn't make sense at all, and we're supposed to be models for the community as well as the schools. I think it's a total wrong message.
So I had flipped. I think we should have in-person meetings too, for the exact same reason.
Okay, I'll let you know.
I would say hybrid, because again, be, sensitive to the members. There may be people that have extenuating circumstances because of health that can't.
Right.
So, I mean, just as we would do in any kind of situation, so I would.
So this is a challenging one, because I think I absolutely see all the rights. I think I've talked about this with many boards of education. I work with several boards of education across the state, And I think everyone is kind of struggling with this because you're not alone, everyone agrees. We have students coming to school. We want people to be able to interact, participate. We're saying it's safe. But by the same token, it's a little bit different. Because when we have students come to school, we can do it in a very controlled way. First of all, we know which students are. We know how many students are coming. When we have a board meeting in a large setting, we don't know how many people will come. We don't know 100% that we'll be able to social distance appropriate or whatever is the appropriate social safety protocols that would be put in place. So it's a challenging issue because while I agree the optimal situation would be to allow people to attend our meetings as they always did, the reason that this executive order exists is because we also have to think through those safety concerns and we have to make sure, because like a meeting room like this, if you got a lot of people in this meeting room, I don't know that we could social distance appropriately. And then the alternative might be to move it to a larger space, which is in your schools. But I don't know if you're allowing visitors in your schools right now. And if you were to allow a large number of people into your assembly hall at the high school or wherever, are you then potentially contaminating, bringing in germs that may be contrary to our plan and are raise cleaning concerns and other exposure issues? So it's a challenging one. So this question, is it permissible to have the public participate virtually in the board in person? That's kind of a hybrid approach, like what was suggested. Originally, my office, we were kind of hesitant about doing this because if you read when we look back at what the actual, I don't need to go back, but the actual executive order really contemplates that you be electronic. It doesn't say, it says you're suspending the open meeting requirements because you're doing it entirely virtually. So we were worried that if somebody were to bring a complaint, we weren't sure how the Freedom of Information Commission would interpret that because the Freedom of Information Commission generally tends to err on the side of caution. So we weren't sure how that would pan out. Some districts have employed the hybrid approach, and now the Freedom of Information Commission has weighed in informally and has said that they haven't had a case, so there hasn't been a decided case yet, but the attorney on behalf of the Freedom of Information Commission has weighed in and said that the hybrid approach may be appropriate as long as you're making certain that the public has real-time access to the meeting, so can actually participate, they can hear, see the meeting as if they were present in person, if those safety issues really exist. So if some of the things that I just mentioned were in play here, if you were nervous about the large crowds, or you were nervous that you didn't have a space that you could socially distance appropriately, or you were nervous that if you moved to a space that could socially distance appropriately, that it would somehow negatively impact your other plans, which are keeping students safe, you can do something like have the board in person and the public over online. They also, I think, I was surprised, but I think the Freedom of Information Commission might even allow you to set a certain cap on the certain, let's say, but I do think that's problematic because it's hard to turn people away. Once they come out and they come to your meeting and then to say, we can only socially distance appropriately 20 people, where are you going to send them to? And then if you send them, does it implicate all those issues that I just mentioned? So I think this is a little bit of a complicated one. I don't envy you. I'm happy to help if you want my help in sorting that out.
Can I ask,
but it's a bit challenging.
I understand the constraints of like being able to socially distance within a space, but let's say we had a big auditorium and it was fine. But are we then held to the indoor gathering rules of 25 or what sector?
I don't believe the indoor gathering rules apply to you. Because if you read those indoor gathering rules, they say that they are for social gatherings, which I don't think a public meeting is. It's not a social gathering. So I don't think they're applicable, and so I don't think you would be held to them. But the question is, of course, the implied piece of that is if they're saying social gatherings should be held to a certain number because that's what can be safe, should you be doing that? Right. And are you then, even if it doesn't apply, do you as a reasonable decision maker, right, do you still think that's in our interest? Or is that playing with fire? And that is a challenging decision point because I think both
I think for us, it makes a difference because our facilities are really closed to the public. And so by opening the facilities, then we would need to then think about how it's going to be cleaned and what's gonna happen the next day. So for us, that, I think it just brings another challenge to the way in which we would operationalize
Right,
having a meeting where it was open and having, whether it's 20 or 50.
right. I think that's true, right, and I think you gotta think through those things.
Rebecca, may I perhaps make a suggestion, just in the interest of time, that we go to the scenarios and then work back to some of the
Sure.
perhaps statutes or something that might apply? So if we started, so here's one, and then we have a few others, maybe work backwards, I think would be helpful.
I think at this point, mostly it is hypotheticals, but yes, we can do that. Let's start with this one. So, the Nutmeg Board of Education was scheduled to meet at the Board of Ed meeting room for regular meeting. However, given that one of the items on the agenda was a controversial one, the board anticipated a crowd larger than the meeting room could accommodate. The board decided to move its meeting to the town council chambers. Bob Bombast pointed out to the chairperson that the file agenda listed the board meeting room as the location for the meeting, preventing the board from changing the location of the meeting. Is Bob correct? Is there any way for the board to move its meeting location? Are you bound by, if you say the meeting is this room and a large crowd shows up and it's not safe, are you able to move the meeting?
Don't you need 24 hours notice?
Well, ideally, it would be great to have the 24 hours notice, that would certainly help. But you can actually move the meeting, you just have to provide notice. So I would post it on the website, I would post it on the door. I would do everything in my power to make sure the public knew that we were moving the meeting. Because the issue is we want the public to be able to know where we are. So if that's literally a sign on the door in the old room where it was supposed to convene and also on the website, all of those kinds of activities, make it public that you are changing the meeting. Are there so now since we're talking, yes, question?
No.
Okay,
Discretion.
since we're talking about large meetings, some other thoughts, some things that we might want to talk through. Are there strategies that the board can employ to keep control of the meeting in light of the large crowd? Are you able to do anything to make sure that the crowd stays ruly, or not unruly? Or is that impermissible because they get to say whatever it is they want to say? Yes,
There's, you can put time constraints on the amount of time that they can speak.
as long as they're uniform, right?
Of course, yes, not
Right, you
even.
couldn't say, well, you know, for you it's 2 minutes and
Yeah,
for you
no.
it's
And are
10.
we able to decide that in the meeting? We would have to decide that in advance, right? That would have to be,
You should actually have, well, so for
Some-
public comment, you should have a bylaw that says that that has some time constraints in it. That's the best case scenario, because then it's already set in stone, it's an expectation. But I've had a couple of times where I've had public hearings, which are very unusual, and I did put them in the slides. If we don't get to it, you can share it with them, but they're very infrequent. But there is a statute in Connecticut that allows you to have public hearings with a certain percentage of the public vote. And on those instances, what I did was create the rules, because they're not in the bylaws often. I created the rules on the front end and we issued them to the public first, saying, if in anticipation of there being a large number of people, we're gonna follow we're gonna follow the same rules we would with public comment. It's gonna be 3 minutes a person, and it has to be civil, it has to be on point. You know, you can make those kinds of requirements, as long as they have to be viewpoint neutral. Obviously, we can't pick on one side versus the other, but we are able to do that.
I've seen some places do the same thing with the 3-minute time limit, but also say public comment is limited to 1 hour in this agenda.
Yes.
But then there were more people that wanted to speak.
But then what you'd probably want to do is adjust. You have to decide, do you only allow the first 20 people to do it, or do you say, now it's not 3 minutes because there's only 1 hour and there's all these people, so now everybody gets 1 minute. I think
But either way would be acceptable.
either way is acceptable as long as you're not limiting. It's hard to do the 1 hour limit
Right.
because you don't want to appear to be picking one viewpoint over the other, right? You want to make it neutral. You want to come up with a way that everybody has the opportunity to speak equally, regardless of what they're going to say. And you are allowed to have certain content controls, like they can't come up and swear and threaten people or be violent or those kinds of things certainly are appropriate. But they can't, just because they're saying something that the board may disagree with, you can't stifle that kind of comment.
We do have a bylaw about meeting conduct that I think only a couple of years old, right? It was specifically to talk about, needs to be civil and what we can do if it is not civil.
But to Jonathan's point, if a large group did larger than anticipated, and normally we allow 3 minutes, we could adjust it to 2 minutes or 1 minute, as long as we did that for everyone that spoke.
I would just find a very neutral way to do that. And to the extent you can follow your bylaw, I always am going to recommend that you follow your bylaw.
Sure.
But I think it's appropriate, I'd have to look at your bylaw specifically, but you'd want to, the intent of the bylaw is to make sure that we're allowing people to talk, but we're not having it be a never-ending process. And we're trying to allow people, we're not judging one viewpoint over another.
So can I ask, in this world of COVID with our virtual meetings, I've seen a lot, as you've seen probably, a lot of different districts handling the public comment piece differently, and it's shifting. I mean, quite a few though are doing what we're doing, which is we're taking that public comment via Google form, which is being read by a Board of Education member. I mean, I can imagine that, let's say as budget season comes, that could get in really like, what is our obligation regarding how that public comment is delivered, and is there any?
So public comment is not actually a statutory right. Public comment is purely a function of your bylaws, which is why I said that you can adjust your bylaws. You have to follow the process by which your bylaws need to be adjusted, but the board decides how to handle public comment. So you can have some boards have no public comment in certain meetings. Like some of them say special meetings don't have public comment. Only regular meetings have public comment. Some boards have 2 public comments per meeting. Some have certain criteria that the public comment has to be limited to, and others have no rules for public comment. So you can adjust that. That's purely a function of your bylaws. So if you, as long as it's viewpoint neutral, as long as you're cautious not to be violating anyone's rights, you're able to put controls on that. And so you do have some flexibility, which is why I think it doesn't address it in the executive order, and that's one of the things that's been very challenging with the virtual world. All right, I'm gonna like skip past these. I'm just gonna highlight the fact that there is, as I said, public hearings and petitions come up very infrequently. I know if there are specific questions about it, Margaret, I'm happy to answer them, but there's a statute, there's a bylaw about when you would have a hearing. It should happen very infrequently, as I said. And there's rules on your bylaw about how your public hearing would be run. And then there's also a statute that references that if 1% of the electors, or 50 such electors, whichever is greater, signs a petition on a particular topic, you can have a hearing on that topic. And that's a statutory right that people have. Again, I've been doing this for 19 years, and I've had 1 such hearing. So they're pretty infrequent, but they're possible. And if they do, I just alert you to the fact that there are bylaws that dictate that. I'm not, at Susie's suggestion, I'm not going to walk through all the executive sessions, but I guess what I want to say about executive, let's see if we can go to the executive session hypothetical and work backwards, as she suggested. So the nutmeg board was in a special meeting when it learned of dire economic news that meant significant staffing cuts were necessary. Knowing that the board would need to discuss and decide the elimination of specific positions and not wishing to needlessly distress or excite its employees, the chair added an executive session to the agenda to discuss personnel matters. With a 5-3 vote, the board entered executive session. After an hour of discussion, the board members agreed, without a vote, to direct the superintendent to cut 10 staff positions. So far, so good. What did the board do wrong? So who can spot something that may not be? What should we could go line by line, but
You can't add item to a special meeting for our bylaws.
Also, it's a special budget meeting.
it's a special budget meeting, right?
So that's
So
one.
knowing that the board would need to discuss, they added an executive session to discuss personnel matters. You're right, it's 2/3 vote, but it's only a regular meeting. Although quite honestly, an executive session isn't really an agenda item issue. It's a way you handle a topic. But still, that topic is not on our agenda, so to Karen's point, they went awry first by doing that. What about the way they framed it? Personnel matters. Are personnel matters something that you can discuss in executive session?
Yes.
Yes, yes. What,
But this looks like a budget matter, not a personnel matter.
it does. And can you just say personnel matters?
No.
No, you have to be a little bit more specific than that, right? And personnel matters, the executive session that permits you to talk about personnel matters, it has to be related to a specific person, and you have to give that party notice that you're going to discuss them in executive session, because they have the opportunity to either have the discussion held in public session or permit the executive session to move forward. So they went awry there because there's no specific person, it's a group of people, and it's probably more of a budget issue. And they certainly didn't talk to anybody and say, hey, do you want to have this in public versus in executive session? As a side note, let's say it is a personnel matter, you approach somebody and say, we're going to discuss you in executive session. Are you okay with us discussing this personnel matter? Let's say they're asking for a leave request or something. There's something over which the board needs to discuss. We tell the person it's appropriate, we're going to discuss it in executive session. We say to them, you have the right to have it in public or to permit the executive session. They say, I don't want it in public, but I want to attend your executive session. Does the person have the right to attend your executive session? Is that one of the choices? Margaret's saying yes, but she's not right.
I'm not right, oh, I thought they were, okay.
But the reason I'm doing this is because everyone gets that wrong.
Yeah.
So,
Is this, so I saw Margaret, so I was gonna copy and
Yeah.
say, yes, Margaret, because I was thinking about the invitation.
Invitation.
Right.
If they invited them into executive session.
Correct.
But the individuals that can be invited to executive session can
It's-
only be,
well, it's determined by you, right? So,
right, so then why isn't Margaret right?
so Margaret's not right because it's not up to the person to decide if she wants to go. The choices for the person on executive session are public, meaning everybody gets to come, or executive session. And then if it's executive session, we could decide to invite that person. Or, but it's not up to her to say, you can do executive session, but I must attend.
Got it.
It's up, if they say executive session, then we get to decide who comes in. And if it's that person, wonderful, and if it's not that person, because there may be perfectly appropriate times where we want to invite them because we want them to explain why they need their leave request. But then there are other times where we don't want them there because we're purposely doing it this way to try to keep things, to have an opportunity to discuss a complicated personnel matter. Okay, so with a 5-3 vote, the board entered executive session. We talked about how you need a 2/3 vote. After an hour of discussion, the board members agreed without a vote to direct the superintendent to cut staff positions, 10 staff positions. Did they go awry there? Yes, why?
Without a vote?
Without a vote. So in an executive session, do you ever vote in executive session? No, so it wasn't wrong that they didn't vote in executive session, but it is wrong that they authorized the superintendent to cut staff positions without a vote. So they should have come out of executive session, made a motion in public session to, eliminate the positions, and then voted publicly, recorded their votes, and followed the rules under the Freedom of Information Commission. So, not ideal. Nothing we would ever do here, right?
It seems to me that there was no need to go into an executive session.
I would say, well, that's what we're saying. I mean, I don't think this is a valid
For
person.
any way, shape, or form with that should all be,
It does seem like
Transparent.
this should be a public right. I
Yeah.
think that's what was alluded to by,
Yeah.
that it really ought to be more of a budget discussion than a personnel matter.
Just while we're on this point though, so to Kathleen's point, because it was here in Ridgefield, because it was a special budget meeting,
Yes.
and we learned of the dire economic straits, the 2/3 vote wouldn't have been able to apply to add that item to that agenda publicly.
Right, so you would have had to have a separate meeting. So that you could do it the next day. If you were gonna do this right, you would schedule the meeting for the following day, so you could do 24 hours notice and you would hold this meeting and you would hold it in public. And then they would make the motion and vote publicly, record their votes appropriately.
Or could you do it right here? You're already in a special budget meeting, it's a budgetary issue.
But it's not on the agenda.
What isn't on the agenda?
The discussion of elimination of positions. Because if you're just speaking about budget generally and the question of whether to eliminate positions, it depends on how it's framed.
Yeah.
It could be on your agenda already, if it was already,
Or
but
if
if there's
it was just-
nothing in any of the materials, nobody anticipated this issue, it's outside the reasonable scope of what the agenda reads, then I would do a separate.
So Rebecca, I think we have one more scenario here, maybe we can work through this one before we wrap up. This is the
Sounds
electronic
good.
communications.
Yes. It was time for the Nutmeg Board to elect officers. In the week leading up to the annual meeting, the internet was full of emails among board members soliciting support from other members. In addition, board members had caucused within their respective party to decide who would be the next chair. At the meeting, Malcontent nominated Penny Pincher as the next chair. Infuriated, Bob Bombast sent an angry text message to Mal saying, "What gives? I thought we had a deal." Mal responded, "Sorry, Penny is supporting me to vice chair. Snooze, you lose. Any issues?" So,
Board members can't caucus with respective party chairs.
true. Board members had caucused with their respective, right.
Meaning like, not on the board, not the chair of the board.
I think this is talking about like town.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
So they can't
do that, right?
Right. But also at the meeting, clearly what this is trying to get at is there's discussion going on outside the meeting. Do we get nervous when there's discussion going on outside of a meeting? Why do we get nervous when there's discussion going on outside of a meeting?
Not transparent.
It's not transparent, and it could be an illegal meeting, because we go back to what we talked about before. What's the definition of a meeting? Any convening, whether electronic or in person. So if you're text messaging, if you're emailing, if you're calling on the telephone, that is a convening of that group electronically, right? And it's over a subject matter over which you have jurisdiction. It's the decision about who your officers are. And there's a quorum, potentially. If those criteria are met, it's a meeting. And if it's a meeting, you have to have an agenda, you have to have minutes, you have to have all the things we've spent all this time talking about. So this could be if someone were to file a complaint, because when this person yells, "What gives? I thought we had a deal," in a public meeting, somebody might say, "Well, what does that mean?" There must be discussions going on outside of the public event, a public arena. And then they would have some serious issues because they've had an illegal meeting. And it doesn't matter that those conversations didn't happen all in one sitting. It can be that Mal writes to Bob and then Bob writes to Penny. It doesn't have to happen all in one. That whole conversation, even if it's on different days, that chain of communication on a topic over which they have control is an illegal meeting. And so they would have problems should somebody file a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission.
How could they have caucused appropriately? If they were all in the same,
If they're in the same party, they can have a party caucus. I think that this might be people who are outside of,
No, but say, you had them meet with the respective party chairs, who may not be members of the Board of Ed, right?
right, exactly. I think this is talking about the town. So it's people outside of the board. So what about, does it matter that it's text message? No, it doesn't matter that it's text message. And then, because the other warning that I want to get at through this hypothetical is be careful, because all of these documents are also public record. So when Mal says, "What gives? I thought you had a deal," not only could we get a Freedom of Information complaint, but you could get a Freedom of Information request for all of those emails on that topic. And then we would have to disclose all of those emails, and it doesn't matter whether those emails came from your personal cell phone on your text messages or your personal computer and your personal email. So you need to be really careful, because I've had cases at the Freedom of Information Commission where they say, "I want you to go through their personal email and we're gonna find all the things on that topic." So you wanna be cautious about, you're not exempt simply because you do it on your personal cell phone or on your personal email. So definitely be cautious.
And is there a numbers component to that? It's like if I sent a text to Sean to ask him a technology question, and he was gracious enough to answer me, whether it was related to.
Well, there's two pieces of it. That might
Right.
not be a meeting because there's not a
Right.
quorum of you.
Right.
But that would be a public record if it's something relating to something over which you have jurisdiction.
Well, like say, I can't figure out how to get a background on my Zoom. So I asked Sean and he.
Well, that's not something that a board is.
Well, that's what I'm saying, so it has to do- it has to be-
You're allowed to talk to each other about things that are, you
Okay.
know, just like you're allowed to have a social gathering. Of
Okay.
course,
But what about-
you're allowed to call each other and
Right.
ask questions that have nothing to do with over things that you have control, but.
What if they're texting during the meeting? What if we're at a Board of Education?
Oh, yeah.
meeting?
Oh, right.
That's problematic. If you're texting at a Board of Ed meeting, there certainly could be questions about what are you text messaging? And if it's over a subject matter over which you have, if it's something related to, it's a public topic that you're discussing at a meeting, then one, it could possibly be a meeting, and two, it's probably a public record.
But you would have to show,
But-
you would have,
right.
you would have to provide it to show that it wasn't.
Correct. And hopefully this never happens
Right.
because you're cautious and you don't do these things. But what would typically happen, like in those cases where I said with the Freedom of Information Commission, what happens is I look at it first and I say, well, it has nothing to do with it. I talked to the Freedom of Information Commission, I demonstrate that it has nothing to do with it, and it goes away. It's nothing.
Right.
But if you can avoid even having to have the Freedom of Information asking for your text messages, I would say that that is advisable, because it's not a lot of fun. So the only piece that I didn't get to is just talking about communications with staff. And I do think it's important, because I think sometimes with a new superintendent, it's really important to remind you that there are certain constraints in what you can know. And she knows this, but because I like her, I want to make sure that I get to say this to you, and so she doesn't have to say this to you. That I think it's one of the biggest challenges with superintendents working with boards of education is making sure that boards of ed know that sometimes the administration and the superintendent in particular isn't able to tell the board all the information that it wants to have because of a particular role that the board plays. So I wanted to highlight for you that there are bylaws that say that really, first of all, matters, day-to-day operations do stay with the superintendent, and that administrative matters should be handled by her, not by the board. And a big part of why that is because you have to, there are certain instances where you have to act as an impartial judge. Like in an expulsion hearing, you're not supposed to know in advance all the gory details of what happened with that student, because you're supposed to make a decision at that hearing based only on the information presented on the hearing and not based on other information. And if administration provides you that information, they may limit your ability to serve in that capacity. And so there are times where administration may very well really want to tell the board information because they want to have the support, they want to have open communication, but they're constrained by some of these roles that you play. Similarly, school accommodations hearings, bus stops and residency issues, again, you have to serve in that neutral capacity. Teacher tenure hearings come up the most, right? The board is saying, we know Mrs. Jones is really struggling. You know, we want to know what's going on with Mrs. Jones. We want to know what the administration is doing to help her succeed in the classroom. Parents are complaining that she's really having a rough time. The administration may be unable to tell the board because the ultimate outcome, which we hope we never get to, but at the end point, if ever we got to a situation where we helped Mrs. Jones as much as we possibly could and we had to part ways, if Mrs. Jones were to contest that, the board would have to be the impartial party that would hear that process. Even if an outside hearing officer heard the facts, the board has to, the determination by an outside hearing officer has to be presented to the board, and the board makes the final decision about whether or not Mrs. Jones maintains her employment. So because of that, there are times where administration really can't tell the board certain information about certified staff. Not because they don't want to, but because they want to make sure that we don't put ourselves in a position where the board can't serve that really important role that it needs to serve. So I just want to make sure that that's highlighted as well, and that was it. That's the key pieces. I'm happy to give copies of my presentation.
I actually have it, and I'll share it with the board along with tonight's presentation, the full presentation, so it's embedded within mine.
Excellent, all right,
Anyone
good.
have questions for Rebecca before? Nothing? All right, thank you, Rebecca.
No, thank you for having me, and, I'm sorry that I had to do, board rights and like speed. I talked fast, as fast as I possibly could. But it's so good to see you all. I'm glad you're all healthy, and I'll talk to you soon. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank
So it looks like
Thank you.
the luck is on our side, the dinner is late. I haven't seen Cheryl. Does anyone need to, no? You wanna just peek out the door? If she's not there, then we're good. Thank you, Rebecca.
All right, I'm going to.
Bye, thank you.
Grab a cookie on the way.
Oh, no, Rebecca, Cheryl ordered you dinner, Rebecca, to take
Oh,
to
she
go.
may have. I told her that she didn't have to because I knew I was gonna be sneaking out.
Well,
but-
you might catch her on your, does anyone need a break? Do we wanna get up and, are we good?
I mean, I don't wanna hold you, so I'll just sneak out, and if she gives a salad, then someone can eat an extra salad. But thank you guys again for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good to see you.
All right, so welcome, Liz.
Thanks, sorry I was late.
No, we're glad to have you.
As I could.
So we're gonna make like an awkward transition from roles and responsibilities and legalese and all the stuff that I think we need to know, just to go back to, at least when I started, I had a lot of grandiose plans about an entry plan, and some of those came to fruition and some of them didn't, so I'm hoping to share out a little bit of what I've learned over the past 6 or 7 months, I guess, just about that time. A superintendent, they're all the same. If you were to Google them, you'd look at the purpose, and the purpose of an entry plan really is to listen and learn, and then subsequently from that, possibly identify the need for strategic planning, which we'll talk briefly about tonight, a mission, vision, and perhaps a 5-year district goal. Oftentimes, some type of theory of action will come from the listening, learning that a superintendent might do. Board of Education goals may come from what we've learned in an entry plan, or district goals and action steps. And I think for all of these could perhaps apply, but for sure, I think district goals and action steps would be where I'm sitting right now. And I think what's really interesting about the past 6 or 7 months is that, and even tonight, is that our focus has been on the reopening of school. That's what we're living, breathing, and everything else. And ultimately, as Margaret shared at the start of this meeting, this will end, and we will reopen schools fully, and children will come back without masks, and social distancing will be a thing of the past. And we have to start thinking about what our school district will be like, whenever that is. And I think that I have learned enough in the 6 or 7 months that I can identify some things that I should be thinking about parallel to the reopening of school, even though I will say, and I know my colleagues share the sentiment, in some ways it does feel a little bit disingenuous to say that I've been thinking about anything but bringing children back to school here in Ridgefield. The entry plan questions that guided, they were all the same. That sounds like dinner. That sounds so good too, right? The entry plan questions that I asked, they were all the same. So the questions that we asked were, what are the strengths? Hey, Cheryl, perfect timing. What are the strengths of the Ridgefield Public Schools? What are the challenges for the Ridgefield Public Schools? Opportunities, and what else I might want to know about the Ridgefield Public Schools. I had lots of meetings with lots of different people and many stakeholders. I feel like I've gotten to know the community very well. I'm sure there's a lot that I don't know. But ultimately, the opportunity really allowed me to engage with constituents to develop a deeper understanding of the Ridgefield Public Schools from broad perspectives, gain an understanding of the community, its history, its core set of values and our priorities, and then create relationships that communicate collaboratively and transparently. And I think, and I've been able to do that to an extent, and I think that there's still work to do. So the buckets of strengths, and when I say buckets, it's just overall what the trends or patterns that continue to emerge regardless of who I spoke to. Whether it was a board member, a teacher, a parent, a cabinet member, is that the community has high levels of parent engagement. And what's interesting is that sometimes you'll hear that in some communities, and they'll say high levels of parent engagement are a strength, but also a challenge. I didn't really hear that here, and so high levels of parent engagement was certainly a strength. A value on the whole child, and what I mean by that is that there wasn't a particular focus or an emphasis on just academics or athletics or the arts. It was really uniquely balanced in this community, and that's what people kept saying. It resonated throughout many, many conversations. Again, there were bits that aren't here, but generally speaking, this is what I've heard. The curriculum, which is kind of ironic because you'll hear about that in a minute when I talk about challenges, but for sure, people thought that the curriculum was a strength of the Ridgefield Public Schools. Choice, that was specific at the high school, and my guess is that that probably came up because we were also in the middle of budget season. And that's something that I should have mentioned, is that I really did have to pull the layers back on things that were happening simultaneously. So there were things that were happening during my entry into Ridgefield where I was in the midst of a budget, right? There was lots of questions around things that were related to money, and there was anxiety over the arts and losing faculty, coupled with the reopening of school and people being afraid and technology. And so all of those things were like on top of this, and so I did have to try to pull back some of the layers. But choice was definitely something that I kept hearing about as a strength. Again, it could have been because of what was happening at that time throughout the budget. Community and volunteerism came hand in hand, is that it's a community that feels very cohesive, even though at times it might not feel as inclusive. It still felt like this is a community that comes together, that rallies, that does the right thing, that we're a tight-knit space, and Ridgefield has a unique way about it with respect to that. In volunteerism, which brings me back to the why you're here, and I heard many of you say tonight that why I'm here is I want to give back. I want to give back to the community. I believe in public education. I believe in advocacy, and that was certainly relevant. So in terms of the challenges or opportunities, here were some of the buckets. And if I would say that there was one overarching umbrella, it's actually the last one around communication. Less community, but communication. And the reason that is throughout every single thread that people spoke to, even when they were critical, perhaps, or said it was a challenge, they kept coming back to, because no one told us, or we didn't know, or no one is saying. And so around teaching and learning, for sure the consistency in curriculum, in particular at the elementary school, but even at the middle schools, but because there's two, right? So that's where you're gonna get that. But in particular at the elementary school, there was a lot of, and at the other schools they do. I hear that they're teaching this here and not necessarily at our school. Supports for all students was kind of interesting because it wasn't where you think it would land. Like, so there was definitely some questions, concerns, wonders about students who are receiving supports through IEPs or through intervention, multi-tiered supports here, SRBI. But there was this other continuum that people kept talking about is no one does anything for the gifted kids. We identify, but we don't support them. I don't hear about what they're doing to help my child be challenged. So that theme resonated around support. So it's really supports for all kids. For sure, we could hear it around SRBI, but I would say, if anything, it was more on that other end of the spectrum. The notion of innovation is there was a trend around, are we being innovative enough? Are we out ahead of things? Are we being responsive as opposed to reacting? And again, could that have been that fog around technology and personalized learning when it came to being in a remote experience could have lent itself to that. But there was certainly a theme around, what's the next thing that's going to happen, which leads me to a vision around technology and curriculum. What's happening? Where are we going? What's the next thing? Are we behind other school districts? I hear this is happening in that school district. Why aren't we doing that? This school district offers that. And not to run comparisons, but the comparison that or the piece there though is just about, are we behind? Is there something more that we could be doing for our kids? Is there a new idea? Is there someone leading the new ideas? That was certainly relevant. And then again, what I mentioned earlier about communication, the biggest piece there was really about transparency, and so there were questions around, let's say, finance, but it wasn't so much that there was questions around finance, but we didn't know that that was happening, or we wish we heard, or how is that connected to the curriculum initiatives. The transparency idea, not so much that it was divided on party lines, like political parties, but we hear that PTAs hear this, but what about other parents? What about other people in town? Some people hear it, some people don't. If you're not on the distribution list, then you don't know. And so there was, if people knew, maybe they would rally behind it, that kind of idea, I would say, bubbled up. And again, it was an overarching theme around, there might be things happening, but I just don't know. People don't tell us. If you're not communicating, or we're finding out after the fact, there was that general idea. Even though, as to go back here, there were so many strengths around those same topics that seemed to be what I would say resonated in terms of the challenges or the opportunities to be better. So there may be a lot of good things happening, but we don't always know about them, and we want to know. So let me go back to this before we jump for dinner. So after dinner, my colleague in the back of the room that's going to facilitate us around how these pieces fit into the vision of the graduate, the master agenda, the priorities of the board. I'm hoping that, I don't know that it'll all fit in perfectly by the end of tonight, but it'll come together and we can start seeing the connections between this, the work of the board, and the goals of the Board of Education, and certainly the administrative team. And so I'll leave it at that with an awkward transition to go to dinner, which I think we can, for folks that want to stay in this room, they can. If they, obviously you have to take off your mask to be able to eat, so we're 6 feet apart, we should be able to do that. But if you'd like to and you're more comfortable, the room adjacent to us is also open, so you can grab your dinner there if you feel like you want more space and want to head off there. And so because we're running behind, could we have an abbreviated dinner? Maybe like come back for about 6:50 around that time, and hopefully we'll have some time to socialize. And I think the second part of our night will be a little bit more interactive, and we'll be moving around the room a little bit. Make sense? Okay. Sure. All right.